Greetings, it is Matt from Hidden Machine here. Every month or so I like to kind of take a little time to talk about some of the games I've been playing recently. And that's what I'm doing here in this video. I got a handful of games I want to share with you, things I want to talk about, things we were sent for review, things we were suggested, and yeah, just a little, hey, did you ever play this? What do you think of this one? Quick mini reviews. We'll get into that in just a moment, but first I want to say thank you so much to all our supporters over on Patreon and here on the channel and the YouTube memberships. It really helps us out a lot. Goes a long way. If you dig it, what we're doing, even $1 a month helps us out big time. And well, let's not procrastinate. Let's look at some fucking games. We received a review key for GRAVEN a little while ago, and since then the game has gone through a few updates, with various systems being rebalanced and tweaked. However, even with those changes, the game is still getting pretty mixed reviews. On the surface, it might look like kind of a throwback to something like Hexen or Heretic, but in action, it's kind of an unbalanced mix between an RPG, a boomer shooter, and some kind of Metroidvania. It doesn't feel like the game is picking any particular thing to focus on, which left me feeling kind of bored by my time with the game. There isn't any great feedback for a lot of actions. Things feel floaty and unpolished in a very particular way. The game does have a really strong atmosphere. You start the game in an area that's been affected by a plague, and as you walk around, you can really feel the effects of that plague, and you hear people crying and moaning in pain in these houses, and there's bodies and debris all around. But yeah, I was really drawn into that at first, but the longer I played, the less the atmosphere was doing to keep me engaged. I noticed a lot of kind of reused assets all throughout the game, which reused assets is fine, but it felt just kind of like copy and paste after a little while. I feel like the game could be a really strong RPG if it was balanced a little bit differently and if the world were a bit more filled in. Unfortunately, it seems like the game is having a bit of an identity crisis, which makes it hard for me to recommend. There are some rather positive reviews out there for the game, but my gut tells me that it might be best to just give this one a little more time to cook. It had been in early access for several years, but given the size of the post-launch updates that have been coming out since January, I kind of wonder if it should have stayed in early access a bit longer. I'm gonna keep an eye on this one to see how it continues to develop, and hopefully I can have a better time with it later on down the line. Anomaly Agent is another game that we were given a review copy of. I streamed this demo during a Next Fest event last year, and I was really into the game, and I've been able to put a few hours into the full version of Anomaly Agent, and I'm happy to report that it is very good. The game is an action platformer that has a pretty fast pace and puts a strong focus on timing and reactions to enemies and environmental hazards. There's some anomalies loose in the world, and you're out to track them down. These anomalies are causing all sorts of impossible and crazy stuff to happen, so you're always encountering new, very imaginative scenarios and characters. The action is broken up into what feels like a bunch of short mini-levels as you make your way to the boss for that section of the game. Every time you get to the end of one of these screens, your health refills, and you set a checkpoint that you can restart from. I really like this approach. I feel like it gives the game a really great pace, and it's the kind of thing that you can play in shorter sessions and still make, notable progress. There's an upgrade system, lots of different attacks and weapons, and a bunch of quirky dialogue interactions. The choices that you make in those conversations will net you positive or negative emotions that you can cash in for the currency that's used to purchase upgrades. There's a whole lot going on in this title, and I think that a big part of the appeal is just seeing it all for the first time, so my footage is all from pretty early on in the game. It's a bit tough for me, even on normal difficulty levels, but it's also so well designed that I never felt frustrated when I failed and had to replay a section. It's a really super smooth game that gives you a lot of abilities and tools to work with. The visuals and music are spot on in my opinion, and overall I think Anomaly Agent is definitely worth picking up if you're a fan of any kind of 2D action game. Rival Megagun came out in 2018, but I only heard of it a few weeks ago. The graphics looked pretty appealing to me, and I decided to check out the demo, which is what I'll be discussing here. I haven't picked up the full game yet, but the demo is pretty meaty. The game is a competitive shoot-'em-up where you and your opponent both play the same stage at the same time, and the better you perform, the more chance you have to send damage and obstacles over to your opponent's side of the screen. It's challenging, but it's a lot of fun, and it's a great twist on a very well-established and sometimes kind of stagnant genre, the vertical shmup. The presentation here looks so good to me. You got these pixel art, anime-influenced cutscenes, and the whole thing looks and sounds to me like some kind of lost Neo Geo game. You may have heard of Twinkle Star Sprites, which Rival Megagun takes a lot of inspiration from. If you enjoyed that game, or you're a fan of shmups, I think you should give this demo a spin. I covered a game called Slime 64 in my last Roundup video, and it was a post that I made about that game that spurred someone to suggest that I try out Kidz 64. This is a 3D collectathon style platformer that stays very true to that mid to late 90s style that we saw in games like Mario 64, Donkey Kong 64, and all of their contemporaries. The game has some unique mechanics, which you'll use to explore levels and collect items. For me, it felt fresh and familiar at the same time. The game has a very distinct and somewhat crude sense of humor, and overall has a very strong and unique identity, despite the fact that it's playing off of so many old tropes. In recent months, I've spent quite a bit of time with Mario 64, Gex 64, and Donkey Kong 64. While that decompiled PC port of Mario 64 plays super smoothly, going back to the original N64 controls and camera can be pretty frustrating for me. These are fun games, but the past few decades worth of 3D game development has left a lot of these older first-generation 3D platformers feeling pretty awkward for me and a lot of other people. To be honest, I even thought these controls were pretty awkward back in the day, but I just dealt with it because, well, there were no other options. Kidz 64 gives you everything you'd want from one of these older games, but it does just enough to modernize and smooth out the controls and camera, and it does so in such a skillful way. It doesn't just feel like a modern game with old school graphics slapped over it. The level design, combat, and the puzzles, they all feel very old school, but not having to wrestle with the camera just helps me to more fully immerse myself in the game. I would definitely recommend this one to anyone who has ever had the itch to dive back into the N64 era, or to anyone who's always wanted to play some of those older collectathon games, but you just haven't done so for whatever reason. Kowloon's Curse: Lost Report is a demo and prequel of another game called Kowloon's Curse, which is currently in development, following a successful crowdfunding campaign. It's a first-person, turn-based RPG. It plays like an old dungeon crawler, it's grid-based, and the devs were inspired by Japanese adventure games from the Dreamcast era. The full game has been delayed a couple of times now. It was supposed to launch in May of 2022, then it was pushed to December of that year, and now, for the time being, there's no set release date. But this demo shows, to me at least, that the devs are working really hard on something that I feel is very special. The demo is pretty big, and it got a large 2.0 update back in November of 2023. The story is set in a futuristic cyberpunk version of Kowloon Walled City. If you're unfamiliar, Kowloon Walled City was originally built as a Chinese military fort, and it eventually grew into a city that was home to nearly 40,000 people. There is no real government oversight there, so there were no building codes to adhere to, and crime and corruption were very prevalent. It was evacuated in the late 80s and then demolished by the early 90s, but for the purposes of this game, the city still exists far into an alternate future. The game has a crazy amount of style. Everything here looks just so good to me. The sound, music, menus, all of it, it's just right up my alley. The writing is quirky and often very humorous, and I actually really love the humor here. I don't always love comedy writing in games. It can often be very cringe, but cringe is subjective, and I think this rules and isn't cringe at all. But there's still a lot of heavy and dark topics being discussed, despite the fact that the game does have such a kind of quirky, humorous tone. For instance, I got into a side quest where I was tasked with recruiting people for a Scientology-like church, and that story took some turns that I was not expecting at all. I really don't want to spoil anything. So much of this game is about discovery and exploration and just finding all the secrets that this city has to offer, but I can confidently tell you that the demo is just packed with really interesting content, and it has a decent amount of replay value due to all of the different choices that your character is going to be faced with. I found the combat to be pretty satisfying. There's these little QTE-style mini-games that determine the outcomes of your actions. Also, there is a smoking cat, which, to be honest, is something that I think too many other games are totally lacking in. I was immediately in love with this game, and I would strongly recommend it to any RPG fans. There's a great amount of depth and character in the world here, and it's really exciting to know that this is just a small piece of what's being planned for the full game. And there you have it. That's most of what I've been playing lately. Now, I also did recently get a Steam Deck about 1 month ago. And in that time, I've kind of come to understand what kind of games I like best on it. And I've used it quite a bit. I feel good about the purchase. It's a very fun kind of, form for playing games. I found that certain games like the Final Fantasy VII Remake feel really good on there. I'm playing a lot of that. I also completed SteamWorld Dig for the second or third time over the course of a weekend. That was a lot of fun on there. I've also been playing an absolute ton of a game called Backpack Hero, which I've talked about on the channel before. It's a really fun RPG dungeon crawler. It's got a village building element, but the whole thing is based around inventory management, like the Resident Evil style inventory management with the grid and rotating the items. And I could talk about that game for days, but not today. We've already discussed it in the past. Just check that game out. Don't snooze on it. Really good game. Great game on the Steam Deck. But that's it. That's what I've been playing lately. I'd love to know what you're playing lately. Please leave a comment. I mean that sincerely. A lot of the games I play, I find out about because, people like maybe yourself have told me to check it out, and I really appreciate it. And hopefully I can share something with you as well. All right. Until next time. Goodbye. Having a tender moment here together.